Hello, Canada Files viewers. This is Aidan Jonah, editor-in-chief of the Canada Files here. This is the 10th episode of Canada and Palestine, the War on Zionism. I am here with co-host from Free Palestine TV, Laith Marouf. Laith, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Laith. So let's get into the situation with the axis of resistance. And before we do anything here, we're going to save the ICJ decision discussion for the Canada side of things because obviously Canada will have much to do around that. Okay, so Laith, can you please take us through the events of the Axis of Resistance that they've taken on in the last week or so?
Obviously, the repercussions of Yemen targeting Jaffa, and the quote-unquote Tel Aviv region with a drone named Jaffa are still playing out. We Yesterday, Ansarullah released a video showing the drone actually, and showing it being launched towards Jaffa. And since then, of course, the Israelis attacked Hodeidah, the port city, blowing up the oil tanks and the electricity plant in the city. And everybody's right now waiting for Ansarullah's retaliation. And it was very stupid, of course, what the Israelis did because they targeted civilian infrastructure, and their own infrastructure. Civilian infrastructure is very vulnerable also. So the big expectations right now is that Ansarullah may target the gas fields in the Mediterranean and or the containers for oil products in the Haifa port, as the Israelis did. And this would be a catastrophic situation for the Zionists, given that already much of the north of Palestine, occupied Palestine, is almost has no electricity because of the constant attacks by Hezbollah in the north. And on the point of Hezbollah, there's been huge escalations also since then. Hezbollah has retaliated to attacks on civilians in southern villages by targeting new colonies. There's at least 7 new colonies in the north of Palestine that became daily targets. And we're talking about a zone now as deep as 20 kilometers of North Palestine that is within the constant targeting by Hezbollah.
So one thing that even struck me a lot was when you had the Zionist entity and you had Tel Aviv and other area being struck. The Yemenis, there was flyers dropped almost, of course, because the Zionists, when they're perpetrating their genocide, they would drop these flyers telling people to go certain places. So it was almost like a finger right to the face of the Zionists, a complete reversal of the of not complete reversal, but definitely a reversal of the dynamics there. And among many other things, the fact that the Yemenis could do that, especially just the Yemenis, right? And I'm not saying just the Yemenis because they're not anything to be scoffed at. No, no, they're incredible. But we haven't seen the IRGC truly enter this. We haven't even seen Hezbollah truly enter this. So if effectively what is this probably the second, third, or yeah, biggest element of this axis of resistance, though you'd know better on that exactly, Laith. To me, anyways, if they can do that, I mean, how many hours does Israel have if Iran comes in? How many hours do they have?
Yes, yes. Look, you know, if we think about it, it's a huge strategic mistake what the Zionists did. And it's probably also a trap that the axis of resistance laid, given that it was done just before the scheduled visit of Netanyahu to Washington, which he's going to be speaking and probably getting the approval. The idea was that he was going to get the approval probably to attack Lebanon. And by having Ansarullah do this attack, and then now, given that the Zionists attacked Hodeidah, Ansarullah, the government in Sana'a, said that they're not anymore just a support front for the Palestinians in Gaza, but now that they are engaged in direct war with the Zionists. That means that, you know, it will be daily attacks. There'll be big attacks coming. We don't know how big they are. And this is great because it distracts the Zionists away from the possibility of a full-out war with Lebanon. And I think it follows the strategy that the Axis of Resistance has been showing us for the last 10 months, which is they're trying to limit the killing field into just the extermination camp of Gaza, try to limit the casualties outside that, while at the same time, uh, you know, causing the internal collapse of the Zionist colony. So they, hopefully can liberate Palestine without a full-out war. But as we see, like the Zionists are not going to accept that, and they are, conducting themselves in ways that show that they want to go out to a full-out war. I doubt the IRGC or Iran will enter this battle anytime soon. It's all going to be in stages. And But Netanyahu is clearly, along with Blinken, keep on talking about Iran and nuclear weapons and what have you. So there is the intention of having a war with Iran. Will the United States get to have that? The Zionists, would they get that anytime soon? I'm not sure about that.
Okay, Laith, thank you. So I think it's time to shift things to the Canada front, and the most obvious thing to talk about by country mile is, of course, the ICJ decision. Pretty monumental one, but that's what people have been saying. But Laith, I want your thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Canadian government hasn't made any public statements yet about that, and similarly for most of the Western countries, because if, as the ICJ ruled, that the Zionist colony is conducting war crimes and crimes against humanity and apartheid and genocide, anyone that is any government that is supporting this activities of the Zionist colony are also going to be found guilty. And so we see how the mass media in the West is ignoring this story on purpose, and how these governments are ignoring these stories. And I think looking at Canada specifically, we see how there's hundreds of charitable status organizations beyond the Canadian government itself having all these free trade agreements, and Quebec having these free trade agreements, and or having all these contracts for military equipment. We have all these charitable organizations that are sending hundreds of millions of dollars to arm and the settlers in the West Bank, to loot land in Palestine, and of course to send war criminals to conduct war crimes in Gaza and the West Bank. There's hundreds of Canadians that have been already sent to occupied Palestine, funded by. Sorry about that.
It's okay, Laith. Let me
Yeah.
jump in. Let me jump in there. So on your point, Laith, someone like Evangler, of course, has talked about this a lot in terms of the regulations around charities in Canada, and how that's in the supporting of these settlements that these charities do are in flagrant violation of charity rules. Of course, you also mentioned in terms of sending Canadian settlers to support the Israeli settler regime. Uh, you have, in both cases, it's what I mentioned last week on the show. The law is just, it can be used and abused. As you said, it very much, sometimes it can just be words on a paper. If the ruling elite in Canada wants to, as with the support for settlements and the allowance of charities such as Hessig Foundation of Heather Reisman. These organizations can flagrantly violate Canadian law or CRA regulations around charities, and they just get away with it because the government is very happy for them to pursue with the actions they do, irrespective of the laws of the land.
Yes, yes, and this is where the role of citizens and their activism comes into play. There is no democracy or justice in a colonial settler state like Canada. So people can talk about these issues of the charitable status of these organizations and or the trade in military equipment that the colony of Canada has with the Zionist colony to raise awareness and attention. But that's not going to change anything. What is needed to be done is to take direct action, as we see, for instance, Palestine action in the UK destroying on a weekly basis Israeli weapons manufacturers that have factories in the UK and or factories of weapons companies that are building parts that supply to the Israelis. So if we don't see that happening in Canada, there will be no progress. There will be no change. The Canadian government has no reason to listen to any of its citizens, not only this issue or any other issue. And similarly, in terms of these organizations having charitable status and these projects that are sending war criminals to conduct war crimes in the land of Palestine, if the quote unquote anti-Zionist Jewish activists don't take any direct action against them, not only the Canadian government doesn't care about them, the Zionist lobby doesn't care about them either because they're not a threat. So, we look at what happened, for instance, this week in just today in the Congress with these Jewish activists walking in and occupying the lobby area of the Congress because of Netanyahu. What is it going to change? Nothing. But if they would have went and dismantled the offices of AIPAC, they would have crashed into those offices of AIPAC, took out the computers, showed us the information that's there, named who is taking what and who's working for what government. That's a different story. But up until now, what we see is just performative activism that is, on the one hand, making people that are participating in it feel good.
And I want to
On
speak
the
to that, Laith,
other,
because I think that's been a feeling that's been bubbling within me for a long time. I don't know how much of Canadian activism comes out of actual principle. A lot of it has fundamentally felt to me like more and more of a charade. More and more like most activism that I see on the foreign policy front is to comfort and assuage one's own guilt about the nature of the state they're under. I'm not really convinced that a majority pursue it for the purpose of genuine anti-imperialism. Now, I'm not criticizing, for example, I'm sure Palestine Youth Movement pursues it genuinely for anti-imperialism. No doubt about it. I'm not saying everyone, but I think like you understand what I'm getting at, right?
yes, yes, it's clearly most of it is either to feel good for those who participate in this activism and or to give them clout within these quote unquote activist circles, but and also to get as much clout and feel good with the least threat to one's livelihood or what have you. So, you know, those who are involved in these organizations clearly do not want to risk anything for the liberation of Palestine. So how are their activism going to actually liberate Palestine if it doesn't risk anything? This is the illusion of liberalism and the disease that now I think has taken over much of the activist circles in the West.
Yeah. It's there's so little bits of, a fight you can see. I remember seeing clips from protests in Niagara Falls. There was I believe a white nationalist, who did try to attack some protesters there. There was some fight put up, but I mean, that's the best I can say. There's some bits of occasional fight put up, but yeah, we have a similar feeling on it. It's what I said last week. It's the liberation of Palestine will truly depend on the axis of resistance, which is why I've always found it insane when Palestine advocates in Canada, will just babble on about Iran, especially, which is a fundamental part of the axis of resistance. I think the first step to change is humbleness, rising within movements and accepting what Canada's place actually is in the world, which is not a terribly important. In terms of our actions, in terms of what we've done as Canadian left, it's not been terribly impactful on the world. But talk to a Western leftist or Canadian leftist who will be happy to bash on Iran, despite them doing 1 million times more for Palestine. There's not a humbleness. And I think that's honestly maybe even the first step. People need to start being humble and recognizing what other parts of the world that maybe they don't like their exact policies, recognizing what they're doing and questioning what we're doing in comparison.
Yeah, I mean, you compare, look, you don't have to agree with an ideology or religion or what have you. But if you have never achieved anything for your own people, to sit on the side and claim that you know the best way for people across the planet, on the other side of the planet, who actually have liberated their country, who have built an economy, who have, built technologies and health systems and give education and so on, and you are achieving zero as a leftover in the West, it's laughable. I mean, if it's one thing, let's say, uh, if one day the government of Bolivia, which will never happen, by the way, if the government of Bolivia criticizes Iran's internal issues, for instance, I mean, I would understand that. There's now a leftist model that achieved something that has national sovereignty and producing and educating and giving healthcare and so on. But this will never happen with Bolivia. Why? Because Bolivia is a truly decolonial government there, and the movement there understands how the external criticisms of culture are designed to weaken societies, not to better them. Okay, it's one thing that internally, let's say, a society looks inwards and tries to better itself. It's another when it's coming from the outside. And clearly without the Islamic revolution in Iran, and it was an Islamic revolution in Iran. Um, Without this Islamic revolution in 1979, there would be no resistance today in the whole region, not only in Palestine, because by 1979, all the communists, all the nationalists, all the secularists, all the socialist movements that came out in the Arabic and Muslim world in the 1940s and 50s were defeated. The slaughterhouse in Sabra and Shatila was happening, okay? The occupation of Lebanon, and the list goes on and on. So the Islamic Revolution reshuffled all the cards here and created a model of sovereignty and nationalism and self-sustainability that expanded and gave hope to the rest of the region, movements of revolutionary movements, and finally, as we see, has now become the main supply line for technologies and weapons that is driving the expulsion of America from Western Asia and the end of the Zionist colony after 100 years of this debacle.
So, speaking on other parts of the destruction of the appearance of Canadian democracy, of course, we know never existed in the first place. There's a Zionist MP. He's former public safety minister, Marco Mendicino. Now, according to some Canadian mainstream media, calling for a creation of quote unquote protective zones around the political constituency offices. And of course, guess what this comes under? It comes under the Foreign Interference Bill. They're gonna protect us from the evil foreigners by continuing to repress us harder and harder domestically, right? What a geo golly lovely group of absolute psychotic colonialists that they just love democracy. They just need to quote unquote restrict harassment near their offices, which is where people protest, the parliamentarians at their offices, because not everybody can fly or go 20, maybe 30 hours if they're on another side of the country, drive to Ottawa. Just what can I say? These angel MPs, their feelings might be hurt if people are 50 to 100 meters near their constituency office. And they're doing this under the good old Anti-Foreign Interference Act. Aren't they just such heroes, Laith?
They are. And we saw Mark Miller also complain about graffiti on his office and calling it terrorism.
I think that was what sparked
So,
it. Yeah, that's
yes. So this is a trend now happening in the whole West. We see the same thing being talked about in the UK. And of course, the only member of parliament that was ever harmed or killed was a pro-Palestinian parliamentarian at the time of Corbyn a few years ago. I forgot her name right now. That was killed by a far-right Zionist. And so clearly, when they're talking about foreign interference, what they mean is those outsiders, those others within the Canadian society that don't look like us. Okay, it's not like China is coming to demonstrate in front of or Chinese citizens are coming to demonstrate in front of an MP's office, or people from another country. These are citizens of Canada that are going to demonstrate in front of the office of an MP that they elected or represents them supposedly. So we are being told that these citizens are foreigners, okay? They are not part of us as Canadians. They don't look like us, but the Israelis look like us. Ukrainians look like us, and they are civilized, and they carry arms and commit genocide against Russian children and Palestinian children who are not like us. This is ultimately, we see the whistle, they're preparing, they're using language that the ultra-right uses. Now it's liberal MPs that are using it, which is, making it more and more the center. The ultra-right now in the whole Western empire is the center, okay? And that, any modicum of liberalism is being shed away from the state.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think about how Macron in France was basically trying to get Le Pen elected. Of course, somehow managed to fail on that front, but I mean, he was certainly, and his ministers were certainly trying. It's like the situation with Trump. He's definitely being primed for power, as well. Yeah, they need those hard punchers, as you said. There's no use for the liberals. Just like there used to be a use for the liberal Zionists, there's no longer a use really for the liberals right now. They aren't going to help the empire survive. And so I want to shift gears a little bit to the one of the elements of the ICJ, because it's talking about the Jagmeet Singh, the NDP leader, of course, the Social Democratic imperial man himself, where he's talking about the need to follow the request around Palestinian statehood, right? Of course, that idea still comes around the two-state solution, and that's where this much ballyhooed vote that came in earlier this year, the NDP initiated, and everyone was losing their mind and joy about, which myself and another writer for the camp files criticized that heavily. One of the points that eventually came out of these internal discussions in Parliament and the eventual final resolution that was voted upon was the question of the statehood effectively being conditional upon Israel being willing to engage in negotiations around a two-state solution, right? So first of all, two-state solution is very much illegitimate itself, right? Because the idea is Palestinian liberation. That's the basic idea of everything for anti-imperialism. But fundamentally, right, even if you actually buy into the two-state solution idea, right, here's the thing. Israel, the parliament, the Knesset, just voted recently against the two-state solution. So, right, so you have that. So right now, the liberals can use the excuse, and this is what I tried to warn myself and another contributor tried to warn about, is all Canada needs is for Israel to just refuse to do a two-state solution, and Canada can just not do anything, right? That's the strategy of it, and it's playing out, just like the Canada tried to warn people about. There's going to be no two-state solution, right? It's going to be Palestinian liberation or outright Zionist domination, like Greater Israel. It's not going to just be Palestine, it's going to be Greater Israel. That's what they want.
Yes, yes. And, you know, you look at it this way. In 1948 or 47, whatever it was, the UN did this non-binding General Assembly vote to partition Palestine, where there was practically no Arabic states that were in the General Assembly, and the Palestinians were never consulted. But even then, what we know as 1967 borders is much bigger than what the partition plan was. So the ICJ, in its attempt to legitimize the two-state solution by saying the Israelis have to leave territories occupied in 1967, they purposefully ignored territories occupied in 1948, most of the north of the Galilee, north of Palestine, and much bigger parts of the area around Gaza and what have you. So it just doesn't make sense, except if they were trying to legitimize this 1967 two-state solution. Ultimately, as we see, as you mentioned, the Israelis reject the two-state solution. They voted to a binding resolution at the Knesset. And this is why we see maybe finally Abbas and his collaborationist clowns have went to China and had a meeting with the 14 Palestinian factions that include Hamas and signed a agreement under the protection and guarantees of China to have a national unity government that should come into effect and would be the one governing the occupied territories. So is it going to happen? I'm not sure if Abbas is still a traitor. Will he flip at one moment? But they definitely did that. So, and that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the Knesset vote and this ICJ ruling.
We will leave it there for this episode, Laith. So, to the Canada Files viewers, thank you very much for watching all the way to the end. If you appreciate the journalism and analysis done by both the Canada Files and Free Palestine TV, that makes this show possible. Please go and financially support both the Canada Files and Free Palestine TV. Laith, thank you for co-hosting as always.
See you soon.
All right, goodbye, everyone.